Welcome into the second Church Reset chat. This time I've got a guest I'm very excited to have on. I was obviously excited to have Spencer. I'm excited for all the people I get to talk to, but Michael Lilly is with me today. He has a great Substack you should be following, testeverything.substack.com. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, and I had him on for one particular one he wrote, and man, it went viral over there on Substack for good reason. It was entitled "The House Church Myth," and so I want to talk to him, pick his brain a little bit about the idea of house church. So thanks for coming on, first of all, and how you doing?
Of course, yeah. Thanks for having me. Doing great. Just finished up the last couple things for a Greek course that I'm in at Heritage. So hopefully get to slow down a little bit after that. And, I spend a lot of time writing and thinking. But yeah, like you said, this post went kind of crazy. And there was a lot of reactions in multiple directions. And
yeah, did you have many people mad at you for it?
Oh, I had a lot of people mad at me for it. But that's kind of, what you sign up for when you start putting your ideas and thoughts out there on the internet. So
that's very true. Yeah. So I think it is a very emotional thing for a lot of people because they think this is the way, like they've found it. And so let's start there, the appeal of the house church, because I think almost a lot of people I talk to, they'll just kind of say, even if they're not ready to do it themselves, like, man, wouldn't it be cool if we could go back to how they did it back in the day and where they just met in houses and got together and so there is that appeal. And I think there's good appeals and there's bad appeals. And so I'll just put that to you. What do you think are the different appeals, and is there more good than bad, or where do you stand on that?
So originally this idea of house churches was presented to me by a minister friend that I had that was one of our ministers at Double Springs for a while. And he recommended me read some work by Frank Viola, who I'm sure a lot of people are somewhat familiar with, but he has two books in particular, especially Pagan Christianity and Insurgents, that really kind of talk about this idea of this simple, small, intimate gathering of house churches. And I think that in and of itself is kind of some of the better things that people are looking for. They're looking for real, genuine connections. I think a lot of people are becoming more and more disillusioned with the whole mega church system and the fog machines and the lights and the concert that happens in the worship. And so the idea of everyone actually sitting together in a room and interacting with each other rather than watching a stage show, I think is one of the big appeals of this idea.
Right. Yeah, I wrote my book, Church Reset. I released it in 2020, and Viola, he was one of the guys I read before reading or writing, and I never went as far as he did, but that, church has become a business, and it should get back to being a family. I'm on board with all of that until it's like, all right, and so let's throw the building away and get back to this. So I agree with you. There's a really good appeal. I think there is a bad appeal, and there's an anti-authority streak in some of these people. At least I've seen that. Have you seen that?
Yes, absolutely. People don't want to be held accountable, right?
Yeah.
They don't want somebody else to tell them what to believe or what to think about, certain topics. And so there's these personality conflicts that can happen that then just kind of destroys the whole house church community that you've tried to build anyway. And so even if that doesn't happen, you end up with kind of some of these theological echo chambers where, well, our house church does things this way. And, there's nobody kind of keeping everybody else in check as far as that goes. And so maybe some more charismatic people in those groups end up bubbling to the top and kind of developing into some cult-like dynamics. So yeah, I think that's kind of the negatives I see is some of the, like you said, the problems with authority. These groups are notoriously fragile, and just there's no checking of egos and personalities, really.
Right. Yeah. Anecdotally, this is not data, but from afar, what I've seen is very much the rocky soil thing. Of it grows really fast, and there's all this passion and energy, and like you say, it hits that wall of what are we going to do? Who's in charge here? All that, and then the fracturing, as you said, it kind of starts. Sorry if you had anything to say on
No,
that.
just the idea of like a democratic gathering.
Yeah.
It doesn't really work. People naturally look for, leaders and authority figures, and then, some people may think this person should be the leader or this person should be the leader, and it kind of again devolves into those personality clashes.
Yeah, I mean, when Paul uses the word repeatedly with Timothy and Titus, entrusted, like you've been handed this to protect it. Everybody didn't get that, and that always ends up that way.
Yeah, and even in the early church, Paul's writing to the Corinthians, and people are making factions. Well, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos,
Right.
and that's just what happens. That's what people do.
Yeah, it's kind of a denial of human nature for sure. One of the things I loved about the article is that you demonstrate. I mean, without like it's inarguable that the concept people have of history is not correct. That man, just for the longest time, and this was kind of the Viola claim, is basically until Constantine, where everything changed, and then we went to buildings with pulpits and all that. That it was just friends coming over for lunch, sitting around talking about the Bible, kind of thing, and that's what the early church did, and we've got to get back to that. And so, break that down a little bit about why that's actually not what it looked like.
I think the biggest oversight as far as that goes is that the earliest Christians were Jews. All those people in Acts chapter 2 that were baptized into Christ on the day of Pentecost, they were Jewish, which means that in the synagogues and at the temple, there was heavy liturgy. They had priests, they had rulers of the synagogues, and that was what they knew of how to worship God. And so a lot of that is what got carried into early Christian worship. And some of the practices even that we have today are still from ancient Judaism. So I think that's kind of the first thing that people forget about, is that this wasn't some brand new religious movement of people just coming together and deciding to shed off all the religion that they had grown up with. They just basically saw Christ as the fulfillment of that and continued doing that, and essentially just added the Lord's Supper into their gatherings,
Right.
until they were eventually expelled from the synagogues.
Right. I think you mentioned this in the article, but this is one of those kind of conceptions of the religion versus relationship thing, and the house church is trying to go with relationship over religion, but religion was always a part of it. Like, and I'm one of the guys that's most against. We don't have to have the two songs and a prayer and a song and a Lord's Supper and But on the other hand, I think people bristle against that. We have a start time, we have an end time, we have a set worship service. But like, is that historically documented? Like, that's kind of how it was.
I would say that it wasn't that there was a set time. There were things that they saw as necessary parts of what worship was. So that's, chanting psalms, a reading from the Torah or the prophets or something. And maybe even the leader of the synagogue would give a short homily, like just a couple thoughts about the passage itself, but not these long TED Talks that we ended up with today.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes, depending on the season, depending on, what holidays or festivals were going on, these services would go on for hours on end. It wasn't so rigid like it eventually became, in the sense of, we got to do everything in an hour, and we have to fill the hour, but also don't go over the hour. Right. It was more of, these are the things we have to do when we come to worship God, and however long it takes, however long it takes. But there was a certain liturgical structure to it. It just wasn't, it was more flexible, I would say, than some modern conceptions.
Yeah, that makes sense. You cite Justin Martyr, which, I mean, it's almost as early as you can get outside of the New Testament, and he seemed to pretty well lay out for us. And as you say, like, there was not the opening announcements, closing announcements an hour later kind of thing, but it does seem to track pretty well with all of those things there, right?
Yeah, yeah. That there was a liturgy of the book, a liturgy of the word, so to speak. There was a liturgy of singing and of worship and of praise, and then uh, again, those things came from the synagogues, and the one thing they did at the end before everybody left was the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. And they would even, once that was done and everybody was dismissed, they would even take that bread and wine that was blessed and take it to, the shut-ins, the, widows, the orphans that couldn't gather there or whatever. They would take that to people who couldn't attend, as a kind of extension of the worship. So,
Right. So, and the house church thing, the kind of friends sitting around the couch talking about the Bible, I get the appeal to that. Like as we talked about, that's great. On the other hand, taking that and putting it in place of worship, that's kind of where you go wrong. And so, I think we would probably both agree that there's room for that, and that's a good thing for Christians to do. But making it into be what the worship, essentially the center of church life, the Sunday morning gathering or whatever, is probably overstating the case for it.
yeah, absolutely. It's not to say that, you know, we shouldn't follow the pattern of Acts where they were, going house to house every day and sharing all things in common. Those things are well and good, and we should do those things. But they, like you said, they're not a replacement for what happens on the first day of the week, which is the coming together of these Christians to celebrate the Lord's Supper. And I think that's part of the problem, is that most people view the Sunday worship as either going to listen to your favorite preacher preach a sermon, or you're going to sing songs and do these other things. And people have kind of missed the fact that the real reason that Christians gathered on the first day of the week was to commemorate the death and resurrection of our Lord Jesus. I think that's where a lot of it has kind of gone sideways, is people either putting these preachers and these personalities on a pedestal, or the opposite end, wanting to just sit around with their Bibles and hear a word and sing some songs with each other. We've completely missed the fact that it's about partaking in the Lord's Supper.
That's interesting. So I'll put you on the spot here a little bit. I didn't put this on the list of questions I sent you. What are ways where we could kind of meet in the middle and take good early church practices, but not misunderstood ones, like what the house church is doing a little bit, and change and adapt what we do to hit that emphasis a little better and be more like what they did than what we are? You talked about like the clock on the wall. I think that's a big part of it, of like not having to get everybody out in an hour so they can make it to lunch on time or whatever. So what are some ways in which we can center the Lord's Supper better and things like that without deconstructing everything the way that sometimes happens?
I've thought about this some over the years. I think one of the things that that we could do potentially, and again, I don't speak for every Church of Christ out there, and I'm not telling anybody's elders what to do, but I think putting the Lord's Supper at the end of the service as essentially the last thing that people are left with to think about and to remember that they came to do would potentially help. Be one of those things that you just kind of leave people with. And then frankly, I think we should just spend more time doing it and thinking about it and talking about it, because what happens so often is, somebody gets up and, maybe they read something from 1 Corinthians 11 or
Right.
some John 6 or something, and then they just say the same prayer for the bread that and the cup that they've rehearsed their entire lives, they've heard their entire lives. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but we kind of just breeze past it to get to
Right.
the fun stuff that we want to do. We want to sing songs and we want to hear a good lesson. Um, I think spending more time with it and really breaking down what it is we're doing, understanding the gravity of the moment and the time that we're spending in this remembrance, um, I think would go a long way.
I have been a place or two where they do it at the end, and it changes the dynamic a little bit. I like that. And the other thing, we train people to preach. We don't train people to give a Lord's Supper talk, and that I hadn't thought about that until you just said that. And it's just picked up by osmosis. They've heard them, so they get up and kind of repeat the words they've said, and maybe put a twist on it. And some guys do a little more study and bring more to it, and that's always appreciated. But yeah, that should be trained. That should be something that the men of the church, if you're going to do that, there's some level of expectation there.
Yeah.
All right, so I kind of chased that rabbit a bit. I want to get back to the historical thing because there was a really interesting thing you put in the article, and that was a picture. I'm going to pull it up here on screen. Does that come up okay?
Yep.
Yeah, of the 3rd century, so in the 200s, a church, and now this is part of a house, right? Or is like,
Yes,
okay.
this is the Dura Europos church that was unearthed in Syria, and essentially what it is it is a house that they basically knocked down walls and built other partitions for to turn it into a worship space. And it's one of these very early cases where, we see that these house churches were not just people coming into a house and I said it in the poster, singing Kumbaya and
Right,
getting their
right.
guitars out and, reading some psalms to each other. It was, this was a place where people lived, but there was this, you can see these dedicated rooms and spaces that were living quarters that were repurposed to become sacred spaces, essentially.
Right. Yeah, this was really eye-opening to me to see that even the concept of house church is a bit misleading, if somebody's not kind of dedicating their house in this way, and whether, maybe it's a wealthier member that has a bigger, budget to do something like this, but that it was not, as you say, a living room singing Kumbaya, that it's kind of made out to be today. So, yeah, I just appreciate you putting that in there because, like I said, I didn't realize that. I don't think most people realize that. When you say they met in homes, I mean,
What does that mean?
My house, your house. Yeah, like that's if I had a group of people over to my house, that's what we would have, and
Yeah, and there's some other sources too. I'm trying to remember the name of the author, but essentially there's this thing that I read a while back that went into more of the socio-economic realities of what those house churches were, where in this ancient Roman culture, house churches were hierarchical environments, right?
right,
They're governed by either the male head of the household or even in a lot of cases some sort of like wealthy patron that owned the property and allowed other people to live there. And so these patrons or the head of the households exercised, a lot of authority over what went on there. And Philemon, it seems like, was one of these, patrons that
right,
had a church that was meeting in a domus, a house that he owned. And so he had, this level of authority and leadership, again, going back to that rejection of authority and leadership that people look for in house churches. Again, just another kind of example of how we have a modern idea of what a house church is, but it totally is not what the historical reality was.
right. Yeah, that's cool to see. So one other thing I was going to ask you about, I'm real big. I use this phrase, stuck in the 1st century, that we kind of think, all right, this is how the church was when the New Testament canon was closed, and it was always supposed to be that way. And so this house church thing is an attempt to get back to what people think it was in the 1st century. But my point is the church developed out of that. And I use that to talk about like political theology of, yes, they were persecuted. Yes, they didn't have any power, but that doesn't mean that the church was never supposed to influence culture. Like if you baptize enough people, your city's going to look a little different, right?
Yep.
And so that's how we grow it. So on the church level, Yeah, they met in homes, as you say. Very quickly they started adapting their homes or whatever else. The movement towards buildings, towards pulpits, towards those things that Frank Viola basically categorizes as Constantine taking over Christianity and making his own version of it, and that it had become corrupted and all that. Is that development, was it a bad thing? Was it a good thing? What does that teach us about the development of the church away from Acts 2, people meeting in houses after Pentecost, to now they have a building and a pulpit and a paid preacher? Are those bad things, or were those necessary developments?
Um, I don't I don't think they were bad things, right? I don't think it is a bad thing to have a visible church in the community that people can point to and say, that's where the Christians are. If you want to find the Christians, go right there,
Right.
this building, whatever it is. At the same time, again, it wasn't a development from Constantine, it was a development out of the synagogues. And
Right.
everybody knew where the synagogues were in the city. They had dedicated spaces for this type of thing. And so, again, it's just a total historical misconception to say that Constantine and the Romans brought all these things in, because these are all the things that the Jews were already doing. In
Mm-hmm.
when Paul went around and started preaching the gospel, he would go to the synagogues first. Most of the time, he was rejected and would go to the Gentiles. But there's a reason he went to the synagogues first. It's because they he knew where to find people who should be open to this message that he has.
Right.
And I think that translates into our time, where people should know where to go and find God's people. We have a building, we have a sign, we're not hiding. You can come find us. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You know, like you were saying, they were persecuted very heavily before Constantine kind of legitimized Christianity as a valid religion. Um, but I don't think that we should seek to continue to be persecuted and go into hiding.
Yeah, yeah, that's I would fully agree with that. I mean, obviously, people can become too building reliant. Christianity can become too building centric for sure. But on the other hand, that doesn't. I kind of had that mindset for a while. Viola got in my head a little bit about having a building, having a sign. No, we're not doing it right. Like, nah. I mean, that's overstating the case a little bit, I think. And so I'm in agreement with you there. Um, any final thoughts? Any other things you want to cover here that we didn't? Things from the article or whatever else? I think I've asked the questions I wanted to ask, and I really appreciate everything you said. It's really interesting stuff.
No, I do appreciate you having me on, and the support you've shown me with my own work and things like that. So it's really helped me out a lot and been a big encouragement. But I do think there is a simple form of Christianity that exists, that isn't the things that people are getting tired of, right?
Right.
The TED Talks, like I said, the fog machines, the concerts, and that
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. At the same time, I don't think it has to be as heavily liturgical or strictly defined as what some traditions would claim that it has to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, generally speaking, the churches of Christ kind of strike that balance well of doing the best we can to pattern ourselves after the New Testament, while also, for the most part, trying to be historically aware of the things we're doing and make use of things that might be uh, accretions or developments over time or whatever, but still remain true to the apostolic deposit of Scripture. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. And with so many people seeking it out, trying to get away from the big box church, going to the Eastern Orthodox Catholicism, just trying to find, like, we have answers for that. And I think that's something, again, testeverything.substack.com is Michael's site. It's a gold mine. He's really answering these kinds of questions people are asking. So I want you guys to go check that out. Interestingly enough, my next Church Reset chat, Lord willing, will be with Marco Arroyo on church autonomy and the blessing that it is. But Michael's written on that as well. So go check out his site on local eldership and all that. So you're doing great work. Thanks again for your time. This is just really cool. Again, when I read that, it was one of those, like, I had been squirrely about the house church thing, and I was looking to do some stuff on it when I saw your article. Like, I didn't realize any of this. This is great, so I wanted to amplify it. And again, go check it out, everybody. But thanks, Michael, for coming on. And I will talk to you guys all on the next one sometime next week.